It's the real start of the discussion about access. Access to journalists was denied, and many of us found that unique in some respects, although of course the British did it during the Falklands War very successfully, but they did at least allow some correspondence in. But you denied all journalists the chance to go into Gaza. I'd like you to explain first of all why you think the Israeli government did that.
Well, you know, it's a tough job to represent a state while the others here are representing media outlets, and of course a state in war. I understand your need and your desire to cover the events from the area. I understand why you really were upset when Israel denied you this possibility to enter into Gaza and to cover the war as professionally as you could. But me, as a representative of a state, I also expect you to understand my view as a sovereign state who had to wage a war against its enemies, and you have to understand that it was our sovereign decision for our security reasons to avoid letting journalists in Gaza. Let me give you an example. You know that it is. You can imagine that it is very difficult for any soldier to focus on its target when he has to take care at the same time for the life and safety of a foreign journalist who is not his enemy. Let's imagine a situation where a journalist from The Guardian or from Channel 4 are situated in a first floor of a building in Gaza, just doing their job. But it happens that in the same building or in the second floor there is a Hamas gunman shooting at on our forces. It's very difficult to expect our forces to wait until the journalists will evacuate the building until we respond fire.
I absolutely don't buy what Lior says about the primary reason why Israel refused to allow access to Gaza during this conflict was in order to protect the security of foreign journalists. I mean, I think it's much more akin to their desire not to allow this conflict to be reported freely and openly. In the Lebanon war of 2.5 years ago, journalists did have free access. I don't recall any journalists being killed or injured in that conflict, so I don't quite know why you've changed your mind, except for the reporting of that conflict was, on the whole, quite unfavourable to Israel, and I think that Israel then decided that it wasn't going to repeat that experience and was going to ban journalists. And in fact, you know, we know that the Israeli government set up a unit about 8 months ago to actually think about media coverage and the sort of PR around this coming conflict in Gaza. So, you know, I don't buy your answer, and I would say that yes, of course, journalist safety is important, but that's our responsibility. And, you know, obviously we would consider all those things very carefully. In terms of
Egypt.
Applying to Egypt, I mean, eventually that's how all our news organisations did get in, apart from the journalists who went in embedded with the Israeli military, which The Guardian wasn't one of those. But you know, we did get through eventually through Egypt, and yes, of course, we made efforts to get in through other means. But I mean, actually, when you say Israel doesn't control all access to Gaza, I mean, it does pretty much. I mean, there's one entrance, one crossing from Egyptian territory, and you know, actually, they did let journalists through.
Part of the reason that Lebanon was viewed as a disaster, not to say it was a disaster, but it was viewed as a disaster, was because Israel lost the PR battle, undoubtedly lost the PR battle. And I think by blocking journalists, you gave an extra cudgel to your opponents to beat you with. You can't turn around and say, we are the best democracy in the Middle East, that we are the greatest democracy, better than all these countries that are led by tyrants and dictators, and then ban one of the basic elements of democracy, which is freedom of speech, which is exactly what you did. And I think that was bad, that was appalling. And also I think, not only did you do a disservice to the media, I think the Israeli government did a great disservice to its people, because part of the reason the media is there is to work, to show people what is going on in their name. And by banning the media, the international media, Al Jazeera were there and covered it extensively. I think you did a great disservice to the people of Israel who couldn't see what was going on.
Ruthie, did you as a journalist in Israel feel that the Israeli government were right to stop you and anyone else from entering Gaza?
Yes, I did, as a matter of fact. And as it happened, we Israeli journalists, having been allowed inside Gaza since Hamas took over. So one might say that there is a level of envy involved in the fact that foreign journalists have been allowed. But as to your question, as to whether I supported the government's decision not to let journalists in, I did, and I really did think, not for censorship reasons, and I'll get into that in a moment. It really was so dangerous. In fact, the Israeli army was so busy trying to avoid killing civilians. I think it would have just been that much harder for them to also have to worry about journalists.
I covered the war in Lebanon in 2006, and just to repeat what's already been said, we took our own risk assessments and were fine. We were able to cover that with unimpeded access, albeit difficult access to Hezbollah, as would have probably been the case with Hamas. Were Israel's military objectives better met through doing so? Yes, probably, because one of the words that's been connected or associated repeatedly with this conflict has been disproportionate. Now, what it meant, having a lot of journalists on the border with Gaza but stuck inside Israel, meant that of course they wanted reporter involvement. So what did they cover? They covered the Israeli side. So you saw Western reporters wearing flak jackets running around after Israeli ministers to places in Sderot and Ashkelon and nearby cities, which were indeed being hit by the Qassam rockets coming across. Good footage was coming out from Palestinian journalists inside. I've heard the view expressed quite forcefully that Israel did shoot itself on the foot in some respects, because had Western journalists been allowed in there to report objectively on the situation as the war was unfolding, they might have got footage of Hamas militants with their legs blown off or whatever in the hospitals, talk to them, that sort of thing. But did we see that? No, we didn't.
But journalists were banned from going into Gaza, what, 6 weeks before? 2 months before? So were you planning already, 2 months before, the kind of invasion you would have, and you weren't allowed journalists in that 2-month period?
I can tell you that I myself and many of my colleagues and the Israelis, we were very surprised when my government decided to start this operation in Gaza.
I can't quite believe, Lior, that you were really surprised by the conflict in Gaza, because actually we were all expecting something for quite a long time, and I think we were all taken slightly by surprise on the exact timing, i.e. on the Saturday morning. But I think that we were all expecting something fairly big, and if the Western media was pretty much expecting that to happen, it's very hard to believe that those of you that are employed by the Israeli government weren't also expecting something.
Is it the feeling within Israel that Israel doesn't get a fair crack of the whip from the foreign press, and that was one of the reasons behind the idea of denying access?
I think that this is the feeling among the Israelis, that the foreign media doesn't always reflect properly the two sides of the conflict. But I don't think that this affected our decision.